All right, exciting debate, I guess, in front of us. So let me just, for everybody in the audience, kind of say a short opening, few opening remarks, mainly about what are we even debating today. So Gnosis Chain has quite a long history. If you've been in crypto for a long time, you might actually remember that as initially launched as part of the proof of authority kind of ecosystem of chains, and that one was initially a bit experimental because it used DAI as a payment token, and the name at that time was XDAI. Now completely taken over by Gnosis DAO, and it looks nothing like it looked initially. But it's 7 years in running, and today it looks like a, let's say, small Ethereum, in the sense that it's running on the same technology, it's got its own beacon chain, it's got extreme solo staking culture, which I think is very interesting, doesn't seem to experience the same type of issues like we have with PBS and the big builders centralizing essentially some of the block building. 300,000 nodes, that's like a lot to me. Then quite impressive application ecosystem. I think the main ones are Circle and Gnosis Pay. So it's not like, you just deposit your coins into, there's a lot of things that are happening on Gnosis Chain. And maybe two more things that are important for this debate. There's a bridge between Ethereum and Gnosis chain. At the moment, this is like 4 out of 7 multisig, but it's extremely public in the sense that we're talking about the 7 public institutions. Each transaction going in and out has to be signed by 4 of them. And it's all extremely transparent. There's a Bridge Explorer. You can actually see how transactions are signed. And finally, maybe also an important fact, the market cap of a token, when we think about economic security, if that's even a thing, which we might discuss a little bit later, is roughly 500 times less than Ethereum, right? So it's like, there's a big difference in kind of size. So that's the chain that we're discussing today. And yeah, so maybe we can start with positioning statements, and then I will try to add some nuance to the debate and dive really deep. So how about we start with Martin?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I'll try to lay out the case why so far we have decided to explicitly not become an L2. And the first thing is what's actually the core idea of being an L2. The promise, the theoretical promise is higher security, and specifically a guarantee that if you bridge assets from Ethereum to Gnosis or to an L2, that you have high guarantees that you get them back. However, I would say in practice, L2s do not necessarily solve that, because if we look at historically the incidents of where money was lost in large bridge hacks, then actually almost 2 billion are lost. But most of the money was not lost because of keys being compromised, which is the risk that a multisig bridge brings, but instead of code issues, so some bugs in the code. And that is not solved at all if you are an L2. And I would instead even argue that risk is even higher, because the complexity of an L2 is much higher. So in practice, most L2s are not, by that strict definition, those completely trustless L2s. In practice, they actually have multisigs that are often called security councils. Or, I mean, that's what they called. And again, I think it is well, it's critical to have them, but if you have them anyhow, it's questionable how much additional benefit you would get from being that L2. So additional point people bring up is, you need to post call data to Ethereum for data availability. I would refer to our 300,000 validators, and it's not 300,000 nodes, it's 300,000 validators, so it's, I think we believe it's 8,000 or 7,000 nodes. So, but still a significant number that I would at least say, kind of data availability is not a concern. Another argument why we have decided against it so far is, in a way, unpredictable costs. When we start, or kind of a couple of, 2 years ago, when we already had to make those decisions, we wanted to be costs on Gnosis to be less than a cent for 100,000 gas transaction. That was always our target. And at the time, of course, it was still pre-blobs. L2s could often not offer that because the data availability costs of Ethereum were too high to do that. That has currently dramatically changed. Currently, that cost is neglectable, but that's also extremely unclear how that will develop further. So it could happen, or because the cost structure is so, or the supply is fixed, essentially it means right now we are still always slightly below the, or the demand for data availability space is still slightly below the threshold, so costs are essentially zero. As soon as we hit that, costs, it's extremely hard to predict where costs are and where costs go, and they could very well go to a point where some of the applications that we run, for example, the Gnosis Pay, that definitely, again, demands this transaction costs of less than a cent for 100,000 gas. That would simply be completely out of our hands whether that would be the case. So in summary, questionable whether we would actually increase security in some form. A solid home staker culture that I would say data availability concerns are not a thing. And finally, being able to have predictable, somewhat more predictable transaction costs on the chain have been reasons to not go the L2 round, despite everyone else in the ecosystem saying that is the thing to do.
All right, thank you very much, Martin. Vitalik, please give us a positioning statement. And like I say, I mean, let's just keep to the overall ideas, and then we will go deep into specific arguments that Martin has mentioned, and maybe a few others as well.
Yeah, and so I think the way that I look at this, right, is so that you have two chains, and one of the chain is trying to ask in a system that is on one of the chains is trying to ask the question, like, what is the correct, let's say, root of one of the other chains at a particular moment, right? And you have a collection of different inputs that might correspond to that in some different way, right? And one of the approaches that you could take, which is like the base case, is always a multisig. Though the other type of input that you have is like actually some kind of proof system, right? And to me, these are like basically probably the two main options that exist. And there is also a theoretical third option, which is like Ethereum itself, like basically deciding to like recognize the other chain and fork if the other chain forks, but that one's relatively less practical, right? And if we think about those two, right, like generally, I think especially if you're in a regime when two different systems or when two different inputs are medium secure, the thing that is the thing that is the least likely to fail is some combination of both. And this is something that I think under a lot of different assumptions you can mathematically prove, right? So I think there is value, especially when we're in this current situation where sometimes code has bugs and sometimes people with keys have bugs, and there's large instances of things going wrong with both. I think the correct thing to do across really a wide variety of contexts is to do some combination of both of those two things. And I think the L2 stage 1 definition actually is like one of those really good shelling points for something that captures a good compromise in that direction. And then I also look at the long term, right? And to me, in the long term, technology improves, but trust does not necessarily improve, right? And basically, we've already seen technology improve over time, right? We've seen us going from extremely basic things getting hacked all the way back in 2015 and 2016 to there being this core of even DeFi that's relatively stable, and hacks happen on the edges, and the edges push out and push out further over time. And so I think there is a long-term future where code is the thing that actually takes over in security. And I would even say that the thesis that code is the thing that can take over in security, at least for what we might call relatively objective domains, is kind of the underpinning of the entire crypto project, right? In the sense that if that is something that you're not willing to believe, then there's even a case that actually the whole concept of smart contracts is pointless, and even applications should become multi-sigs, right? So I think that kind of argument is the reason behind Ethereum doing smart contracts in the first place, including at the application layer, and it's also the fact that there is this progression of code improving over time, and us now starting to have multi-provers, different proof systems, all kind trusted hardware, various combinations, and so on, is one of those examples of that trend, and we're roughly somewhere in the middle of that. And I think also on this point, right, I think the core point for me, right, is this idea that it's not a binary, it's a spectrum. And once you think of it as a spectrum, it just feels obvious that the correct point where to be right now is actually already pretty not zero and pretty far from zero. And I think the not binary and it is a spectrum thing also applies to the scalability side of layer 2s, right? So I wrote this or post on Plasma about a year ago, and one of my key points that I made on Plasma is basically look, theoretically perfect Nirvana Plasma is hard, but if you start with a Validium, right? So if you just start with a system that you have Stark proofs published to chain, and then you say, well, what can you add on top to protect even a little bit of people's coins if the main actor running the chain disappears? It turns out you can do quite a lot. It's very easy to protect all coins that have not moved within a week, for example, and that's the majority of all coins, right? And so I think with becoming a layer 2, there's a lot of these intermediate approaches that are worth considering it as well. And given Gnosis' scalability goals, actually full-on roll-up is one of the last steps in the roadmap I'd recommend.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you kind of raised that point, because I wanted to clarify for myself and maybe also for the audience the core issue of this debate. We're debating whether the Gnosis Chain should become an L2. And I have a feeling that the community at large has a very vague notion what L2 even is, because I know that there are there's a range of opinion, if you like, from the most strict ones that would insist that L2s are they should really inherit full security of Ethereum. So only rollups and maybe plasma, right? And rollup stage 2 probably. I mean, for sure not validiums, for sure no some hybrid, constructions. They don't inherit full security. They shouldn't be really called L2. So let's call these guys, like the extreme one spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum are people who are saying there's not even such thing because there are only chains and bridges, and there's just anything in between, right? So the concept is kind of hazy. So I'm kind of like curious, like when you say specifically, Vitalik, L2, like what do you really mean? Like, can you like define that for the audience somehow? And maybe Martin thinks that, L2 is something slightly different, and who knows, maybe Gnosis is already an L2 by some very loose definition, right? Like lots of training wheels type of L2.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to like separate the the mimetic and religion aspect of this from like practical technical properties. And I'm like actually, like I'm not one of these arch pragmatists who thinks that the religion is valueless, right? Because I think we do live in an environment where there's lots of people who love just like claiming that they are Ethereum aligned and coming to conferences and like sponsoring them and trying to attract lots of users when like actually it's this like trust me thing operated by people who are like way less scrupulous than anyone that Martin would ever be willing to even hire for any part of his team. So it's and like I think having these like social coordination points and like basically like making hard lines and saying you're not allowed to call yourself this unless you have certain properties, like that does have a valuable social purpose, right? But I think here, if we want to get into like this narrow question of like what Gnosis should do, right? I think it's like, I would say step one is we want to figure out what technical properties it makes sense for Gnosis to have at different time periods. And then question two on top of that is like basically, what do you call it? And like to me personally right now, actually, question one is kind of the more interesting one, right? And to me, the core of question one is basically that if I have an ETH on top of Gnosis Chain, or alternatively, if I have a circle on top of either ETH or some Ethereum layer 2, let's say, I mean, we'll use Fuel as an example because it's like the one that's stage 2, and so it's nice and clean in that way. Then, like in both cases, what are the security guarantees that I have, right? And then case one is if the Gnosis multisig is evil in the sense of signing the wrong thing. And then step two is if or part two is if the Gnosis multisig misbehaves by like failing to sign the right thing and like actually disappearing, right? Like there was, I think, even an incident a couple of days ago, right, of like some layer 2 just going offline and like the L2 beat kind of stage 2 withdrawal functionality actually being crucial in helping people get their money back, right? And like I think it is a spectrum between you get 0% of your money back and you get 100% of your money back. And like I think there are lots of 80-20s along that spectrum, right? So like the concept of a validium, right, that Starkware talks about is like one of those examples on the spectrum, right? And the property the validium has is basically that a chain commits hashes and proofs to another chain, and this is like an extra thing that gets attached to the bridge mechanism. And then you have this property that like if the bridge participants do not have the power to steal, but of course if they disappear, then like everyone's coins are frozen, right? And then on top of that, you can like add extremely basic plasma mechanisms that just say like, hey, if like withdrawals have not been processed for a week, then you start allowing people to use old state to withdraw, and then potentially like it's like the percent of people that get their money back, it goes up like a little further and like potentially goes up quite a lot, right? Or if you want to go in the other direction and say, well, what if the proof system has a bug, then what happens? Then you could make the argument that like, well, you could make a validium but you could make it be overridable with, say, a 3/4 vote of the Security Council, right? And like, if you actually write down the numbers, like if you write down a specific probability model of like, what is the probability that each individual Security Council member either disappears, whether of their own volition or as part of a collusion attack, or because they get hacked, and what is the probability that they signed the wrong thing, and then on the flip side, what is the probability of a software bug, then like, and then you like solve for parameters, then you are going to get, I think, something stage 1 like, where it just makes a lot of pragmatic sense like as soon as you can to add a proof system and give it some share of the vote.
Yeah, so it's all about the properties, right? And I think it's undoubtedly that a lot of existing L2s probably have much weaker trust assumptions than Gnosis have today. But what would be your like definition, mental definition of L2?
Maybe one response to those improvements that we can make and that we are making. So. So we are all about kind of what is really practically helping, and here the improvement we are doing to the bridge is to have light clients as signers, and that at least brings us to a property where kind of no human actively needs to be involved to kind of. Or, no specific human needs to be actively involved to kind of just make sure things work, and then we will still have this governance or kind of security council bridge in case, but kind of just from a day-to-day operation. What is an L2? So I would here go with the strictest definition and say, you need to have inherit the full security of Ethereum. And if you would do that, then you would have wonderful properties. Then you could say all the L2s could fully trust each other, and you could have, if you would deploy a token on one chain, then you could send them to one L2, and then from there to another L2, and from there to another L2, because they could fully trust the other L2. In practice, that's impossible today, because we have, how many L2s are you tracking?
Oh, it's like way over 100
okay.
In production, and
right.
The problem is that we're like launching them literally every day with one click of a button.
So
right?
let's say just 100 L2s. If you would in practice today create such a token that would trust every L2 as if it would inherit the security of Ethereum, then what you would end up is having the weakest security of all the 100. So to really get to this great promise that L2s would bring, I think it's a completely different approach is necessary. And if I would wear my Ethereum hat and kind of, Gnosis has been a project, kind of a contributor or kind of to Ethereum for, almost 10 years now. So if I would say kind of from an Ethereum perspective, I would argue what Ethereum should do is have native L2s. And what I mean by that is L2s that are maintained by Ethereum open source developers that are all standardized. So we have, let's say, 100 instances of them. So there are 100 L2s. They are all standardized. They all are what are called based rollups. So they just use Ethereum as a but they don't have any multisig. They use the Ethereum governance process of hard forks to upgrade if necessary, and that would bring finally the promise that in a way Ethereum had a couple of years ago with sharding, when the plan was still to have, I think, even 1,024 parallel shards that would all execute as or similar to Ethereum. So in that world, so that is what I would say Ethereum would do. But On the flip side, for Gnosis, that would even mean if Ethereum would go in that route, it would become even less relevant to be a non-standard L2, because if you would have then those, if Ethereum would ever do that and have those standardized, internalized native L2s, of course it would make it much weaker than to be a kind of non-standard L2.
Is this something that you kind of like expected, that we're going to end up with hundreds of rollups and L2s being launched with very abysmal trust properties at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning, we were definitely worried about the opposite problem, which is like making sure that we'd have like at least 5 decent ones.
Right, I remember those days. Like, it was a super small L2Bit website, and now we're like struggling keeping up with everything.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I think the based like native roll-up topic is definitely interesting. I mean, I think at that point there's this question of like how much actually needs to be standardized, and even how much needs to be enshrined in layer 1, especially in the long term, for something like that to happen. I'd say, I mean, I do think that there is value in there being layer 2s that are not EVM layer 2s. I think, like for example, the work that IntMax has been doing with Plasma is like a really great example to me, right? Like they have an architecture, it's like a hybrid Plasma rollup construction that requires about 5 bytes of data to be put on chain per transaction, and somehow because of that they're able to be fully privacy preserving and based at the same time, right? And so like that's an example of like something really impressive that an L2 is doing in a way that like fully inherits the security of Ethereum without even being EVM. So I think that niche definitely exists. And I'd say, I mean, from Gnosis's perspective, right, there's obviously the other question, which is in a world where Ethereum does have based rollups, like how does Gnosis see its own long-term role in the ecosystem? And like I think the answer to a lot of these questions will end up depending on that too. So yeah, I'm curious.
I mean, first, I am. I don't see Ethereum currently doing that, unfortunately. So, but if if Ethereum, or if Ethereum would do it, we would need to think what we do. Gnosis does a range of things. So we have the chain, but we also do various applications. Gnosis Pay. Or circles, wallet, Metri. So potentially we can then use those in my view proper L2s again. But of course on the flip side, in that world. Or one thing that's unique about Gnosis right now is that we actually have a beacon chain, and that we actually have therefore also blobs. So it is also, if the world would demand even more block space than the block space that Ethereum could do by having 100 native L2s, then it would of course allow to do the same strategy for Gnosis as well, with native L2s on top of Gnosis.
I actually remember your argument from one of the previous conferences that you were arguing that we cannot scale Ethereum DA to like handle the world's potential future demand. And also, in one of your latest posts, you said that maybe we should, like, at one point do the radical pivot with the DA if we want to handle, all the world's future load. So, so I think, this is an interesting argument. I mean, would you? How do you see like long-term future, right? Can we actually scale Ethereum that way if eventually we run out of ideas how to get a DA that will like have all the potential future use cases?
Right. I mean, I think there, the big question is basically, like what if Ethereum is not able to have a crazy big DA, but Gnosis is, right? Then, like, what is the property of Gnosis that would actually cause that kind of discrepancy to happen, right? But in the way that I see this, the end game of this, right, is that. I'm already predicting that at least for latency and sequencing related reasons, we're going to see L2s bifurcate into on the one side L2s that are basically relatively okay with being centralized sequencers, but then having governance for rotating those sequencers around over time and basically making sure they're not abusive, sort of the standard kind of democratic structure where you have a president and the job of the vote is to kick out the president instead of voting on every single bill, and then on the other side L2s that go in the other direction and actually become based, right? And I mean with based rollups, and I think especially with native rollups, there's also an interesting aspect of this where there is a spectrum of sort of how much standardization and nativeness actually happens, right? Because there's very minimum versions of it where basically all that you're doing is you're standardizing a precompile that does ZK snark verification, and then there's the question of and there's even ways to design it in such a way that people can come in and basically plug in their own coprocessors for their own non-EVM features, and they just have to provide the provers only for that part instead. Outside of that, right, basically, I think there is room for a lot of diversity within based rollups is one of the things I'm saying, right? And so in that kind of world, the other natural trade-off that you get is basically that if there is a limit to the level of DA that Ethereum can safely have, then you would have L2s that just use that DA directly. And then you would have other kinds of L2s that take this higher scale approach, and then I could easily see very realistically that they will end up using basically they're using centralized sequencers to give pre-confirmations in order for lower latency, and then they'll also use some kind of plasma construction, and then possibly using some kind of alternative DA to give as much as security as they can for scalable use in the meantime, right? So I do expect that full spectrum to exist. I think both niches are valid.
So given that we're slowly running out of time, my last question to Martin, considering that the goal is to get rid of the multi-sig bridge, so eventually, we're going to end up with the trust minimized bridge. It comes down to this, vague issue of social alignment, if you like, with Ethereum, whether you're going to follow the Ethereum forks, these types of questions, right? So how would you answer the question today? Is Gnosis safe today? Not Gnosis safe, Gnosis Chain, obviously, today aligned with Ethereum, or is this a fully sovereign ecosystem?
No, it's 100% very aligned. So we use the same.
So you don't have to be L2 to be aligned.
I mean, is it for me to say whether we are Ethereum aligned? It's maybe for Ethereum to say, but we at least, so obviously we use the same clients. We are one of the few, layer. Well, I'm starting to say layer 2. No, we are not layer 2, but we are one of the few EVM chains that actually has 4 clients running it. Most have only 1 or 2. Gnosis has half of its treasury in ETH, so I think in many ways, I think we have a strong open source ethos. Everything we do is open source, so I think in many ways we are value aligned with what I would say are Ethereum values, but we have still decided yet to not post our call data to Ethereum and make the claim that we are in L2 for that reason.
Right, so maybe, now we can take some questions from the audience, if you guys have. I see some people on the left.
I think this is not, I guess I can stand up. Hi, Martin. Hi, Vitalik. Yeah, so basically, it's a little bit more of a practical question. But usually I mostly use Ethereum L1, but usually I will use like a different chain, like Gnosis Chain, for like 2 reasons. Like one, there's like something useful to do there, like Gnosis Pay, I think is a perfect example. And then the other one is kind of like a risk diversification thing, like for my assets, no? So basically, like assuming that we get over like the current bridge risk. One thing that I've sometimes like asked or haven't been like a fan of in like Gnosis Chain is the fact that it uses like DAI as like the fee token, because basically, yeah, it makes it like very subject to like whatever happens to like MakerDAO, no? Or well, Sky now. I mean, for example, now I think it still stays DAI and whatnot, but it can already be there. So basically, my question is kind of like for Martin, and then maybe Vitalik, you can have like an opinion as well. What do you think of like using DAI as a token, and do you think it's still a good idea? And yeah, I know technically it's very difficult to swap, but yeah, just your opinion.
Oh, it is possible. No, I mean, I think I was historically never a fan of the idea to force people to use your token as a form of money. And I think it's much more convenient to use stablecoin or to kind of to onboard. If you onboard with $100, you get $100 and you're immediately able to use them. So I always liked the idea to have to be able to pay transaction fees in stablecoin. So at the point, DAI, well now SUSD or still DAI, was and is still the biggest, somewhat decentralized stablecoin. So I think it's the best option we have. If there is a better option, we would take that better option. But that being said, it's super important to note that the security of the chain does not depend on DAI. So if DAI fails, the chain doesn't fail. So of course, if you hold DAI, you are of course affected, but the amount of DAI you need to hold to pay the transactions are tiny, so you can happily hold other assets on the chain, and you are not affected by what happens to DAI.
Should L2s use ETH as a base token, in your opinion? Most of them do. But,
yeah, I think generally I would say yes. I don't think ultimately the difference matters too much in economic sense, right? Especially now that fees are getting much lower, and we're basically talking about fees being like 1 cent for even regular transactions. Like I think there is an argument that it's like a mimetic thing more than anything else, but I do think transaction fees is just one of those places where ETH as an asset makes sense.
Maybe it's just a UX issue. Okay, so we still have time for maybe one quick question.
Hi, my question is regarding another metric, more like a success metric for Gnosis Chain. Gnosis Chain, I would say, if you compare it to other ecosystems, has been medium successful, right? It doesn't have a lot of users, daily average users. It's just another L1. So you have the choice of becoming either just another L1 as you are now, or just another L2. And I think, my opinion, and I would like you guys to challenge it, is it's easier to stand out as just another L2 by furthering, for example, shared liquidity or some technologies that are on the table, based rollups. These kinds of things make it easier to stand out and get more attention for Gnosis Chain and be more successful in terms of daily users than just being another L2. So that was the question is, what do you think about this different approach on why one would become an L2?
No, I do agree. If we would just become, or if we would somehow do things that we can then make a plausible claim that we are now in L2, I think that would probably not affect the attractiveness of the chain probably at all. I would say at this point, because it wouldn't. I mean, now we would then be L2 number 127, and maybe we rank.
It's always top 10.
So yes, if we would go the L2 route, we would certainly try to do something more interesting, and yes, certainly then things like synchronizing the chains to a point where you are kind of were brainstorming about this idea of semi-based chain. So that would mean, based L2 is essentially an L2 where the blocks are built by Ethereum itself, and that can bring enormous advantages because you can have synchronous transactions that affect state on Ethereum L1 and on the L2 in one transaction, and you have atomicity because the L2 closely follows, or one-to-one follows Ethereum state. And in theory, it would be possible to construct whatever you want to call it, semi-based L2, where Gnosis would do where Gnosis would synchronize its slot times to Ethereum, but do 6 seconds instead of 12. So we would have one slot in parallel with Ethereum, where we share the same state. Then we have one slot in between where Gnosis validators would do that independently, and then again we would have a shared slot, and that that would potentially be something. But bottom line, just being an L2, I don't think that would
I think if you wanted to like grab a niche of like interesting technology space, then the whole EVM plasma direction is like sitting right there waiting, and I think it's a big opportunity because right now there's like basically only one other team that's like doing anything with plasma at the moment, right? And I think the reason why is because like that stuff is technically hard and you have to think hard, but on the other hand, I have a lot of respect for your guys' technical ability, and so I think you actually can pull it off, right? And if you're going in the direction of saying like eventually, you want to have a light client on Ethereum, and then eventually you want the security council go away, and then like it just feels like there's this natural progression where at some point you say the next step is also that the light client itself needs to sign off on transitions to the state function, and at that point you're like literally a Validium already, and then like it just there's just this like natural path, and like then you're not like you're something that has actual security guarantees, and at the same time you're not bound by the L1 blob data market. So I think it's an option that's really worth considering.
Okay, Vitalik, I'll give you like 4 minutes maybe to try to sway voters. We had a vote at the beginning, so we don't know how many of them voted for Gnosis to sort of like stay and wait in the sidelines, if you like. So what would be your argument or arguments, for these people who voted for Gnosis not to be an L2?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people think of like to be or not to be an L2. Like that is the question, as being this like very binary thing, right? And it's this, but I think as like I think we've seen, and as I've tried to argue, like not only is it a spectrum, I think it's a spectrum on which as technology progresses over time, it actually naturally makes more and more sense to start like slowly shifting rightward toward like sort of being like more L2-like, and I would argue that progression is one that's like actually not too far from Martin's existing thoughts and roadmap, right? Because like, so basically multi-sig bridge today, then actually L1 like a light client inside of a smart contract tomorrow, then you know, throw away the Security Council keys, stage 3, and at some point like actually add in validity proofs of the entire state transition, and at that point you know, you're a Validium already, and I think that is already like non-zero on the scale of L2-ness, and then there's just the natural things that it makes sense to add over time from there, and like it's like a natural progression where I think every single step makes sense, and it's something that makes sense to just do over time as technology becomes more trustworthy, which I expect it will, because there's just this massive ecosystem that benefits from that happening and is capable of executing on that happening, and if you do that, then like the end state of that, I think, is Gnosis, you know, like having all of the properties that qualify it as an L2 in every real sense of the word, and at the same time being like very close to things that I've heard you expressing interest in already.
So, Martin, it seems like you're like trying to ride against a huge, you know, wave, if you like, right? And that's never easy. It takes courage, I think, you know, to be contrarian. For people that voted yes, you know, Gnosis should become an L2, what would be your answer? I mean, how would you want them to reconsider?
Yeah, I would say what we care about is building a credible, neutral platform, and we would say Ethereum is one, but there are not many others, and too little others. And we would argue current today's L2s are not credible, neutral platforms, because if you only have, or the way platforms can, in a way, extract platform power is usually not by kind of just blatantly faking some state. So kind of so in the example, so if a platform like Twitter or Reddit extorts their platform power, then they don't kind of create suddenly a fake post of someone. They don't create a post under Vitalik's name that Vitalik never did. The way they extort their power is by changing API rights, by changing pricing, by changing the algorithm, all those things. And if we bring this analogy to the L2 world, then I would say L2s are not credible, neutral platforms, because so far they all, or essentially the big ones all, have single sequencers. And that sequencer has all kind of rights can easily do things like, say, make specific transactions more expensive, or even block them. And yes, then theoretically you have as an application, you have the chance to go through 1 week forced whatever transaction inclusion process, but practically your application is dead then on that chain. So long story short, what we really put a lot of effort into is build up our home validator community. Just I'm curious, as a show of hand, how many people are running an Ethereum validator here? Cool. How many people here are running a Gnosis validator? Okay, it's pretty much same crowd. So yeah, we tried to achieve this, or come as close as possible to the credible, neutral platform that Ethereum is, by putting lots of effort on having multiple clients, having lots of people be validators, and also making a decision so far to try to, as much as possible, not go the proposer-builder separation. So I'm not a fan of the state that in Ethereum, 90% of all blocks currently are built by exactly 2 entities. On Gnosis, we still try to push validators and home validators to build blocks. So at the moment, you can even make the claim that the block building is much more diverse on Gnosis than in Ethereum. Again, we also don't have magical solutions. We might end up with the same economic pressures and so on, not making too big of a claims here. But overall, those are the things that are important to us. And of course, practical security is important to us. And so far, we felt that slapping over this L2 claim will not necessarily increase practical security. With all that being said, of course, we care about Ethereum. We care about being Ethereum aligned, and I will also not exclude the possibility that we will somehow go that route, and at some point, as we improve things, go the route Vitalik described. But bottom line, to start, it's most important to us to have our active own validator set and this strong community of people actually caring about I mean, also kind of the cultural element of just being involved yourself and running a node and being a validator.
So will your opinion change if Ethereum actually delivers, ambitious roadmap with things like, single slot finality and the base spring confirmations and,
inclusion lists,
interoperability standards that, will allow all these chains to exchange messages together trustlessly? I mean, maybe it's just too early for you.
I mean, I would certainly say if things change, we will of course try to find then a niche that we think is useful, and clearly we want to, if there is meaningful interoperability, clearly we want to be part of that. But again, I feel like that's still far out, unfortunately.
When do you expect, do you have a hope that interoperability standards will be a thing, and once you become part of a greater ecosystem, you will benefit?
I expect to see the basic interoperability standards to start happening in the next few months, right? And then I think from there forward, the question is how deep do you want the interoperability to be, right?
Yeah.
And and I expect that to improve over the next years as both L1 and L2 is mature, and of course I expect inclusion lists and single slot finality and those topics to also get really start to become serious development concerns once Pectra is done as well. So.
Beautiful. Let us conclude this debate by voting once again. And really quick, I misspoke, so we're not going to take lunch after this. Martin's going to give a 15-minute talk about circles, so please stick around. All right, so you can scan the QR code and vote again, or there should be a link. If you can't scan the QR code in the back. And to reiterate, at the beginning, we had 28 agree that Gnosis should become an L2. We had 36 disagree, and 9 abstain.
There's votes there on this. Not sure if you can see it
on the screen. I can't see them from the stage.
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's.
It's looking like we have a consensus around disagree. We have 45 disagree. We have 22 agree, and 8 abstaining. 9 abstaining.
All right.
Yeah, okay. Everyone, please give a round of applause for the fantastic debate.